Oh, well, welcome to another podcast of Return on Character. Dan Cooper, your host and founder and CEO of Rock Investments, where we invest in the markets based on the character of public company CEOs. I'm really honored to have on the show today Laura Walker and Lee, MADRE Ventures. She is the founding partner of that organization. I'm going to have her kind of explain what that is. But for now, I'll just say welcome. I'll let you say hello.
Thank you so much.
It's nice to see you, Laura, and thanks for
You
coming
too.
on. For context, let's first just kind of tell me about what you're doing today. And I want you to kind of give us an overview, and don't be shy, because I could read out all the famous people, celebrities, Fast Company, all of these incredible things that you've managed to kind of, to do. But then I want to go back to how you got to what you're doing today. So let's first set the
Sure.
context for today. Tell me about
Yeah.
Madre.
Well, before I do that, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm just so grateful that you exist and that Return on Character exists as an ETF. I think it's so fascinating. One of the things I do for partners and clients is I quantify culture for a living, and I think it's
Right.
it's an important exercise to be able to put some of those findings in graphs and numbers, so it just doesn't seem so amorphous to people. And I think grounding your findings in a way that articulates how valuable it is to have character is it's going to have a long legacy. So I'm excited for that.
Well, thank you. It's
Uh,
nice that you said that.
yeah. So I'd actually like to maybe tell the story linearly, because then Madre
Perfect.
Ventures might make a little more sense.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So my background before venture was in entertainment finance. I still work in entertainment today. It takes up about 10 to 15% of my bandwidth. And I'll talk about the shift into venture later. But I started in the entertainment industry in 2001. I worked in physical production. I was an assistant director. I was a PA. I was a post-production supervisor. I was a studio executive at Focus Features in 2005, 6, 7.
How did you start? But how did that even opportunity open up?
I was going to school at the University of Texas, and I applied for an internship on a movie that no one's ever heard of called The Wendell Baker Story. Luke Wilson co-directed it with Andrew Wilson, the lesser-known Wilson brother, but Owen Wilson was also in the movie. And I got an internship, and I convinced my parents to let me push off my last semester of senior year in order to be on set, because I just really wanted to work in movies.
I love that.
I grew up in a time where film and TV was the most influential medium in the world. It's not so much anymore, for reasons we can talk about. But at the time, I just really wanted to work in the most influential medium in the world. If an analogy I use sometimes is, if oil on canvas had been the most influential medium in the world, I would have been a museum curator. But that's just not what it was at the time. So I was just desperate to get into the entertainment industry. So got that internship, then got a PA job, a production assistant job on another movie, and then another movie. And then Robert Rodriguez, who was local to Austin, he was trying to direct a movie with Frank Miller, who had made a graphic novel. And it was called Sin City. I don't know if you remember this movie. There was a sequel. It's a fine movie. But Robert left the Directors Guild of America because the DGA wouldn't let him co-direct the movie with Frank Miller, because the DGA had a very dumb rule, which was that you can only co-direct with someone you're married to, or someone that you are like a brother or a sister, like someone that you're genetically linked to, which is so strange. So he had to fire his assistant director staff, and I got my break to be an assistant director on that movie. And then I worked with Richard Linklater I worked on Friday Night Lights, just a lot of like local Austin productions. I was 22, 23, 24 at the time. I went back to school. I went to night school to like finish my
So you
degree,
finished
I
it.
walked. My mom, I'm first generation, so my mom was just so like, over the moon about me being able to do both.
Oh, that's great.
And yeah, so worked on those productions, and I was leading crews of anywhere from 100 to 250 people, and I was really young doing it. I mean, a 22, 23-year-old telling a Teamster to do anything is a huge challenge. I was working 18 to 20-hour days, which you can do when you're young, and I would have work dreams where I was, waking up in the middle of the night. I was so stressed. And at one point, when I was 25, I thought I need to go where the creative decisions are being made. And so I saved up enough money and I moved to Los Angeles. And I got a job working at Focus Features. Aaron Ryder, who's a producer, he's produced for like Chris Nolan, and he's just made amazing movies. He was the only person I knew in LA, and he helped me get a job at a studio, which I was so thankful for. I worked there for 2 years. And after 2 years of being in post-production, because I love people, and you don't see very many people in post-production. You're just in a dark room with the same 3 people for like years on end. And so
For
it was
those that
2000.
don't understand what post-production is, what is post-production?
Post-production is editing a movie, putting the score together, and just reviewing the same footage over and over and over again.
Right.
Sometimes the studio executives who make you recut the whole thing. It's a very meticulous process. You have to really care about the details. And so that just wasn't for me. And so it was 2007, and I faxed my resume, because that's what you did at the time. I faxed a resume and a cover letter to a bunch of producers that I admired, to Brian Grazer and Jerry Bruckheimer and Brad Pitt's production company. And I just asked for a 15-minute meeting with all of them. And I got most of the meetings that I requested. And I said, look, I want to cultivate my network and I want to cultivate my taste. Where should I go? And they all told me to go to this place called Creative Artists Agency, which is like a very big talent agency that represents like just so many people.
Right.
Like, anyone from like Madonna to Steven Spielberg to, Derek Jeter to like just like a ton of people. So interviewed there. HR wouldn't have me because I was too experienced to be an assistant. And I met a girl in a bar. She liked me and she said, okay, you want to work at CAA? Come work with me for my boss. Just dress up in a suit. I'll meet you at the elevators every day for 2 weeks. You have to work for 2 weeks for free. And if my boss likes you, then maybe he'll hire you. And that's what I did. I just showed up in a suit and went in the elevator every day and got yelled at a lot. So I worked for him for 9 months, and I sat next to a group on the 3rd floor called the Film Finance Group. So I was working in the motion picture literary department, and my boss represented like James Cameron, who was directing Avatar, and like Paul Greengrass, who was making huge films at the time. And these were like big studio movies. So my boss was usually in the mix on bidding wars that in the 7 and 8 figure range for his clients. And that had its own level of excitement. And then Steven Spielberg's agent asked if I wanted to work for her. And I was thinking about it. And someone from the Film Finance Group said, you know how to budget and schedule, you're producerial, you should come work in our department. And I went to go do that in 2008, which was what they did in that department was raise money for movies. So 2008 was the worst year you could have possibly, decided to do something like that.
Sure.
And so I think that year we made about 2 movies. It was nothing. And so...
But you didn't do the Spielberg opportunity.
No, I didn't. I didn't, because the value proposition from the film finance department at the time was work here for a year or two, then go produce. And my end game at the time was, well, in order for me to independently produce, I need to know how to raise money. So may as well learn it here. I'm never going to learn that listening to Steven Spielberg's agent negotiate his contracts. So I
Right.
decided to go in that department. And I was the only one with set experience as well who could budget and schedule. And they didn't have anybody like that in the department. So I became an agent at that department. And the ecosystem of entertainment started to change. So 2008, all the studios were owned by parent companies. Like Universal was owned by GE at the time. Paramount was owned by Viacom. And so all of these parent companies were just going through their portfolios looking to scratch off big line items. And what the parent companies didn't understand about the studios was that there was these things that had been in place for 100 years called overall deals or first look deals. So, Viacom, this is a theoretical conversation, but Viacom might have said to Paramount, why are we paying Tom Cruise $12 million a year just to get a first look at his projects? Like, if he wants to work with you, he'll work with you. And all the parent companies did that to their studios. And so, directors and actors and actresses and even writers who had these very plush overall deals that was getting everything paid for, their executives, money for their intellectual property, and they were also getting money themselves. Those got eradicated. So all this talent came to the agency and said, I still need to pay my mortgage. I still need to send my kids to school. I have this slate of projects. You need to get them financed. And so my department, I wasn't running the department, but there were only 5 of us in the department of a very large agency. And we were managing about $10 million in AUM a year, which is nothing, in 2008. And by the time we left, our business exploded. I kept the books for the department. So I know what our AUM was year over year, and it surged to over $1 billion a year in AUM from 2008 until I left in 2015. So I went from working on
10
about
million to over $1 billion
yes,
in AUM.
yeah, right.
And you
So I
guys
worked
were
on about
literally
80
just there catching this huge wave of shift in the entertainment industry, and you kind of were the department that caught it. That's unbelievable. I didn't even know such a shift occurred. Fascinating. All right, continue.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I was in the right place at the right time. And it takes grit, it takes many, many hours of work. It takes a lot of things to be able to exist in that kind of scenario, but I certainly caught a wave and I was lucky in that regard. So I represented high net worth individuals and family offices, and I would do the financial modeling and structuring for them on movies primarily. I would have to middle between creatives and investors all the time, explaining the numbers and how the numbers might affect the creative and vice versa. And then the movies would go off and get shot after we closed a financing deal. And then the movies would come back to me as finished products, and I would have to evaluate, did these people make the movie that they set out to make, or is it less than what they expected to make? And I have to evaluate the value of that again and figure out, what market do I take this to? Do I take it to Sundance because it's a small indie movie? Can I take this to the Cannes Film Festival because there's really huge talent, so it'll probably sell for a bigger number? There's a bunch of factors involved with that. And that was the exit strategy for every single film. Sell it to a studio at a premium, get the investor reimbursed, and then move on to the next.
So you have an example of one company that you walked through this process that stands out, that maybe is interesting? You may not be able to share.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to think of a good one. He might tell this story himself, but I remember Matthew McConaughey bringing Dallas Buyers Club to our group. And we had a few successes. Like, we had put together Black Swan, which was a huge success. We'd put together at that time, like The Wrestler and a few like movies that had won some Academy Awards. Maybe Birdman. I think maybe Birdman had already occurred. Maybe that was after. Anyway, so he brought it to us, and he was still a rom-com guy. Like he wasn't considered a dramatic actor at all. And so getting that movie financed, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's not it's not rom-com fare. Was really difficult, and we had sent it to like over 100 investors. And
really, and they all passed on it.
Yes. Same thing with Black Swan, by the way. I mean, I think it was, I looked in the grid, it was like 186 passes from investors before Black Swan got made. And then, of course, for the next 2 years, investors would come back to the department asking for the next Black Swan because it was a success. So, I think that sometimes you just don't have data points, especially when it comes to art. Like you just have to go with a gut feeling, but it's a very risky industry. So Matthew, he at one point just said, "I'm going to keep losing weight until you guys finance this movie." And I don't know if you remember how thin he was in the movie.
Oh yeah.
And he also had gotten Scorsese's Wolf of Wall Street. Remember, he has like a cameo in that movie, and he's so like his suit is just like swallowing him up because he had to keep the weight off for this other movie that he was like determined to make. And so some photos had been taken of him on the beach because he lives in Malibu. And the headline was like, look at how skinny Matthew McConaughey is. And he was really, really thin. And I cut it out of the magazine. I went to the newsstand. I got it. I cut it out of the magazine, scanned it, and sent it to investors. And I was like, Matthew McConaughey is going to die if you don't finance this movie. He's so committed to making this movie. And like, I don't know if that was the reason, but we got financing pretty soon after that. And of course it was like an amazing movie.
That's so the moral of the story or the trick of the game is to starve yourself until you get you get
oh
discovered.
My gosh.
Right?
No, I don't want that.
That's an amazing story. I love it. But there's such a testimony of commitment and faith that it would happen, and and so cleverly played. Wow, that's a great story. Okay, so
thanks.
Where do you go from there?
So let's see. So that was 2015. I was doing really well. I mean, I was representing a lot of actresses. I had done some deals for Meryl Streep, which felt very special. Just kind of being in her presence. I was doing deals for Jennifer Lopez, Reese Witherspoon, Natalie Portman, but primarily my clients were high net worth individuals. And I mean, the job on paper was exactly what I wanted, but I needed to take a leave of absence for health reasons. I went to the doctor. The doctor was like, "You don't have any serotonin left in your brain. You need to take a medical leave." And it was getting hard for me to string a sentence together, actually, which is, of course, essential to my business. And the partners were so gracious, and they said, take 6 months off, come back, work in whatever department you want. And so I took a leave, and then I took care of myself. I did a lot of creative writing, which I'd never had time for. And I've done nothing with it. It's just the act of being creative, I think, is really important. And then I decided I wasn't going to go back. And this actually might be an anecdote for Return on Character that I have some data for somewhere. So when I left, I didn't know what I was going to do. And people assumed that I was going to come back. But then eventually people heard that I wasn't going to come back because I had made that decision. And I remember my husband, who is a creative director and very accomplished in his own right, he had a side project that he wanted to start for a clothing, like a men's outwear, like inspired clothing brand. And I thought, okay, I'm going to help him launch it for his birthday. And I thought, I know how to do this. This is just like sending out a screenplay. Just get my Rolodex, get my Excel files, and just like email people. And I kept data on it all. I have an Excel file somewhere of this data. But the top like 20% of people in the entertainment industry responded to me right away. They bought products, like they just treated me like a human. And then there was a huge drop off for like the other 80%. People I was in the mailroom with, people that I had been roommates with. And, there's a saying, which is New York is hard on the body and LA is hard on the soul. It's a very transactional town. And if people don't know how to transact with you, it's difficult. It's a volume business. They're not bad people. But I think that, there's just this effect that happens in LA for that reason. And actually at that time, I knew that I was going to start a fund because one of my first financier clients came to me and said, I want you to open up the U.S. Contingent of my Latin American family office. And so I knew that I was going to be announcing a fund in 3 or 4 months. And I thought to myself, let me see who my friends are. This is a really good preliminary vetting through this exercise. And that was really, it was amazing to see that the most successful people in that industry, there was a direct correlation between them being successful and them treating me well, even though I couldn't do anything for them at the time.
That's really unusual. Why do you think that is? Is it because of the kinds of friends you had? What is it? I mean, most of the time, people would think it would skew the other direction.
I know. It was very surprising. I wasn't a partner at the agency. Like I wasn't such a heavy hitter that like those were my day-to-day friends. I think that a lot of businesses can be boiled down to a people business. And if you're good with people, if you're a good human being and you just are respectful, it can really get you a long way. And I remember, I can't say who these people are, but after that, I did help facilitate some talent transitions. After I started my fund, I got into business with some, very famous actors. Some of them were considering like an agency switch and things like that. And so what did I do? I remembered those people who took care of me. And I called them and I said, I need to place this person with a really great human being. And they had definitely won my loyalty. So, I think being in a people business, you have to treat people well.
What would you say to the notion that there's not a lot of high character people in Hollywood? Do you think that's true, or do you think that's a myth and it's actually, you can't not be that way because it is so people oriented,
Yeah.
What's your intuition on it?
It's such a good question. I used to be like that. Just treading water. Like my assistant would come in at 9:02 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. And I would say to her, there's this thing called dropping calls. I don't know if you know what that is, but
No.
It's basically in the entertainment industry, you have to call people or email people back within a 24-hour period. It's like an unspoken understanding. And so if I was behind, I could just drop a bunch of calls at the beginning of the day before people are actually at their desk. And I would get mad at my assistant. I'd be like, we could have dropped like 10 calls in those 2 minutes. Like I was in a high volume business and, I had definitely had moments where I was an asshole because I was, trying to just figure out how to deal with the sheer volume of what was going on. But I think I had a lesson a few years later. I was working with a producer, multi-Academy Award-winning producer. And I was working with them and they were like they played into the notion that you mentioned. And it was my responsibility to shield my investors in the family office from the stress that this person created. Because that's what I get paid for, and to solve problems. And so I did that. One day I was talking to this person and I walked into a lunch with one of my investors and he could tell something was wrong. And I said, well, this person's kind of difficult. They're a bit of an arsonist fireman. They're creating problems they know they can solve, and it's not great. And my investor said to me, you are an asset to us and you have to protect the asset. And all the hours that you're spending on this one person, you're not spending on the rest of our portfolio. And he was like, we have a new rule as of now, which is you've been prioritizing excellence over being a great human being. In this operation, it's great human being first with a high bar for excellence second. And no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I really had to think through how to deal with that. And what I ended up figuring out for myself was there's a difference between being busy and being effective. I'm being paid to be effective, not to be busy. So all the lunches, all the dinners, all the, phone calls, like I think sometimes people get caught up in feeling really important in that sense. And I just had to find shortcuts to make sure that I was working with people that I wanted to work with and just cut out the rest of the noise. And it made me a better person for it.
And in the beginning, you don't have that luxury. Lots of times you have to do what you have to do to deal with the dynamics. But that must have been a little bit of a weight off your shoulders to know that you didn't have to cater to that. Leadership or your investors were saying, let's prioritize good people. It's a great story.
That's probably another lucky break I had. Yeah. and you're right. Like earlier in your career, I got some really good advice once, which was in your 20s and early 30s, just meet as many people as you possibly can. So they know you, you know them. But through that process, cherry pick the people that you want to do business with, because in your later years, your business boils down to 5 to 7 people. So who are those people going to be? So I appreciate getting older.
Well, Laura, now I want to go into your business because your business is fascinating.
Thank
and
you.
It's actually, I guess it's relevant to what you're doing now, but it's multiple dimensions more applicable to a lot of different categories. So tell us about what's going on now. You started the fund. You had the courage to jump. That's a big deal.
Yeah. I felt like people's relationship to narrative was really changing with the advent of the smartphone and social media. I think for hundreds of years, we've been used to just looking at static stories played out by people we don't know. And in the last 10 to 15 years, people, I think, have had this 180-degree shift with narrative where they're more invested in their own narratives as they play out against the backdrop of culture than they do sitting down for like a long form narrative and, just being entertained that way. And I thought, okay, if I got into entertainment because it was the most influential medium in the world, really that is my anchor. It's not the medium, it's the message. And so I really started to think about what industries can affect change significantly. And I just thought that founders were so uniquely placed to scale solutions for the problems that we have, more so than government, more so than the Fortune 500, which I can get into later. And I thought, okay, I know how to raise money. I understand comms. And like the analogy I give people now for what I do is I try to be, do you know who Edmund Hillary is? He summited Everest. He was the first person to summit Everest. So Tenzing Norgay was his Sherpa.
Partner.
And so I try to be the Tenzing Norgay to founders, Edmund Hillary, where they know they need to get to the summit, and I am tasked with figuring out how. So sometimes I write my own checks. Sometimes I source capital for people. And I'm just in the final stages of closing my first fund. So I'm very excited about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. So I studied narrative economics in school under Robert Shiller, who he won the Nobel Prize in 2013 for this concept called narrative economics. And
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah,
like what is? I love this. It sounds really interesting, but what does that exactly mean?
Yeah. So narrative economics is the exploration of the stories that people tell themselves and how it impacts economic outcomes. So Bitcoin has a story. Um, Tesla has a story. The American dream has a story. And it influences people's everyday decisions. My thesis was the comparison between Tesla and General Motors, and that GM is actually doing more for the electric vehicle revolution in terms of like just finding new ways for EVs to exist than Tesla. But Tesla's stock price, it touched 2,000 last year. And GM hovers between $50 and $60 very consistently. But
And
the
gets no
stories are,
credit from that,
that's
right?
right.
It gets, yeah, and
That's
Tesla
right.
is the holy child that is
I
actually
know.
birthing and saving the world through their
Right.
batteries,
Right.
battery powered
Yeah,
cars.
and also people don't think about what Tesla's cars will do. Like as Tesla increases the size of their fleet, um, people still have to plug their cars into their homes at the end of the day. And where do they get that energy from? They get it from a power grid that actually exists off of fossil fuels. So as there are more Tesla cars on the road, it's actually a net potential negative.
Right.
Than positive. But there's another story being told, and founders have to do what they need to do to make their company succeed. So I guess more power to them. But I think it's worth having discussions like this to step back and realize, like, oh wow, this narrative is like looming very large, and it's affecting people's decisions. And in terms of shareholders, the average in the 1970s. In the 1970s, shareholders held on to a stock on average for 8 years. Now, in 2023, it's 6 months. So, narrative can really swing the way a company. Shareholder optics are very important right now, and they do swing the market. I mean, people talk about retail
Oh, yeah,
investors and things
for
like
sure.
that. So, I won't even go down that rabbit hole. But yeah.
So, Laura, how do you do this for companies? Like, tell me about approaching. I mean, you could give an example. You could say, okay, return on character ETF is an example. How do you go about
Yeah.
doing what you do? What your magic
Yeah.
sauce?
Yeah. So, at Madre, we want to help 1 billion people in verifiable ways. So we look for founders who can help us get to that metric. In terms of the verticals, it's clean energy, mindful technology, and social wellness. The reason why I chose those verticals, it does have to do with narrative, which is there's a huge chasm right now between the stories we're telling ourselves and our lived realities. So, for example, we're living in this ever connected world through the internet, through our cell phones, and through social media and everything. But things like Brexit are happening, and Trump gets elected, and there's a very like it's either you're in or you're out. Like there's kind of an us and them mentality. Like the politically between right and left, it's
For
just
sure.
very, very stark. So it's even though we're connected, it's hard for us to actually have conversations.
Mhm.
That's one. Another one is um, we have a society that is really focused on youth. Um, I saw a Fortune magazine cover that had a 13-year-old on the front. And I think there was a season, probably in like the mid to late 20 teens, that if you were young and you were starting a company, that was heralded as a huge success. And but we're not looking at things like the social security crisis that's coming in 2035, not only in this country, but in other countries as well. We don't have enough money in the reserve to be able to take care of older populations. And so there's a big chasm there. And then there's, also the chasm of the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, but women can only raise 2% overall in venture capital. So like my goal is to bring societal equilibrium into play, like bring those two things together, the stories and the lived realities, because this is our ideal and this is our current reality. And how can we bring those things closer together?
I love that.
So So yeah, that's how we came to the verticals of clean energy, mindful technology, and social wellness. They're also very lucrative verticals if you strike it right. So there's a fusion energy company that I've been working with for the last couple of years called TAE Technologies. And their valuation's at 5 billion right now. The way they built the company is super, super smart. I got that phone call because someone knew that I knew Robert Downey Jr. and they thought it would be cool if Robert invested into the company. And I thought, I can do so much more for you than just introduce you to Robert, which I did do. I introduced the founder to Robert. They did a podcast together, they're friendly. But I raised capital for them. We're also going to deploy some capital from our own fund once it's closed into TAE. And I also took the social listening and data scraping tools that I use to show them what their share of voice is online, in social media, and traditional media. So
Okay, wait. What do you mean? I've
yeah,
never heard of those kinds of scraping tools. Tell us about those. Tell us
yeah.
about what you do with those.
So when I would put movies together, I would usually work with someone called a foreign sales agent.
Mhm.
And we would come up with a capital stack based on value that would help mitigate risk for the investor. And it was literally calling buyers in different countries saying, how much will you pay for this movie? And then we would put them into an Excel sheet and then
Right?
add them up at the bottom. Like that's what that was the process.
That was your market.
Um,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
But technology's come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years. And now, I mean, I have contracts with Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, a lot of other social media platforms. And I can use IBM's Watson to
Mhm.
assess the qualitative and quantitative data of how people are talking about a subject, how they're talking about Dan Cooper, how they're talking about return on character, how they're talking about the ETF, how they're talking about Black Lives Matter. Like it could be
Right.
anything because
Mhm.
it's keyword search. And I can show founders like, your publicist has been working 18 hours a day for the past 2 weeks, but compared to your competitors, your share of voice is basically flatlining. And so what I do is I work backwards from whatever that founder's next financial result is. I figure out what the audiences are that matter, and I craft an approach for them to get to those audiences to procure that financial result. So for instance, I have a founder who it plans to IPO in the next 18 to 24 months.
Mhm.
So shareholder optics are very important. So that's more of a public play. I have another founder that is trying to secure money from the Environmental Protection Agency and the government for government contracts because those contracts are non-dilutive. They don't have to trade any equity in exchange for those
Sure.
contracts. So the audiences that matter for that are politicians, lobbyists, a lot of people that are DC based. I have another founder. We just closed a $20 million round for him, and it was a Series A. Very cool company called Spark Neuro. And it's going through the FDA approval process now, but it'll be the first FDA approved device to diagnose Alzheimer's and dementia, which hasn't existed before, and at very early ages. So like that audience was more family offices, VCs. And so like that founder just needed like a redesign on a deck and, a few other things, a few other assets because it was a very like closed audience. But, managing shareholder optics, that's a totally different
Totally different.
effort.
Yeah.
So, but I use, I always like to start from a place of accuracy because it's very hard for founders. The first thing they want to do is articulate their story and their mission, but they
Mhm.
don't often have time for it. Maybe they have some budget, but they need someone. I try to internally. I try to tell the team like we're trying to be like the McKinsey of culture for these founders, where we are giving them a very high level analysis on where they exist now and where they need to go. And only then do we get tactical in terms of, do you need a PR agency, a marketing agency? Do you need a website redesign? Do you need to go on a roadshow? Like there's a lot of different things in the mix on that. So
And I'm
yeah.
assuming you're not doing this for tobacco companies and arms
Ugh. No,
company. So what's neat
no.
about it is you're taking your talent and your team's and your company's talent, and you're
Mm,
really choosing to direct it in a certain direction. That's
mhm.
what I'm hearing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and there are things that I do on the side, which is why I'm so interested in what you're doing. Like, there have been a couple of side projects I've taken on. Like, I took a corporate and board governance course at Wharton, and I'm currently working with my class just because we voluntarily opted in to think about board governance and the decision making process and how to integrate ethics into that kind of decision making. So that's something that's in process. And then I also, this was a really big lift, but I when George Floyd died in 2020, and there were riots and people were grieving, and it was really really awful. I'm a woman of color. I'm Latina, and a bunch of my peers got calls that Monday, like people were trying to throw money at us, basically. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting. That I've been trying to raise for a fund, and I haven't been able to, get as much traction as I wanted. And there's been like this some sort of paradigm shift. It didn't last for very long, but what I did notice is that a lot of corporations were making promises to Black
Sure.
Lives Matter. And so I thought, wow, the Fortune 500, they have so much influence and so much money, and they're making all these promises. Um, how can I approach this as a data-driven approach and think about not corporate social responsibility, but corporate social accountability? Because we have the tools now to be
Interesting.
able
Yeah.
to keep people accountable. So I
Yeah.
hired a couple of, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that we track is do their words match their deeds, and that's what you're
Oh, we
saying.
we really have to compare notes because what I did was
Yeah.
I hired a couple of researchers and I had them scrape every corporate promise that had been made by the Fortune 500 then and 5 years prior. And I looked at their language. And from there I extracted a process of a way to actually audit companies on their publicly held promises. I think that ESG can be tricky because, mm, well, for a lot of reasons. We don't have to open up that can of worms. But I noticed that a lot of the language is the same and sometimes a copy and paste job from corporation to corporation because they're literally competing in the virtue signaling Olympics
Totally.
to the
It's like a
public.
commodity, right? I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Which
that's
is why
why,
I think the leadership part is just
yeah,
it's so necessary.
yeah, character leads, ESG follows. And
Mm,
if there's not leadership in the ESG space, it's just going to be a report on
yeah.
on a website. What you're teeing into is just mind-blowingly exciting because it's exactly what we're using natural language processing analysis to actually measure integrity now. We have a whole
Mhm.
dictionary of signals that we use to measure responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion, which are the other four
Wow.
characteristics. But
Mhm.
what you're doing around do their words match their deeds is so big. I mean, because that's
Mhm.
authentic, right? And that's what
Mhm.
people care about, like especially the younger generation. I would imagine this would be really highly resonant with them.
Yeah, well, I think the Wall Street Journal reported last year that I can't remember the metrics, but it was like less than a tenth of the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been promised to ESG efforts had actually been deployed. I don't know how they went
Yeah, I
about
believe it.
researching that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I think that this return on character thing is so cool. And I mean, I consider it on like a personal level, on a partner level, on a portfolio level, and also just like kind of on an international level. And
Yeah.
I after this podcast, I would love to just have a separate conversation with you about how I can, fine tune that stuff.
Oh man, it would be a real honor because I mean it's rare to run into somebody that intuitively understands the consequence because one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing is that if we can show the character outperformance, meaning those 4 characteristics, CEOs will start to be hired on that basis, which means you start shifting cultural standards in the way organizations are run, and you're prioritizing the type of leadership that I think, at the end of the day makes the world better, and safer, for that matter. But anyway, let's continue. We'll pencil that conversation that you and I are going to have.
Okay,
Sorry,
good.
everybody, you're not going to get a chance to be a part of that one, but you might see the results.
Yeah.
Tell us about an ideal client that you're that you love working with. In other words, how can people learn about your business? How to maybe see if there's connections with what you do in the world, and just anything that you could share about your business and how we can help promote that story, because I think it's really good and really important. What would help? What helps your
Thank
firm?
you. I appreciate it. I'm looking for founders who are helping us get to that billion person thesis, and we do have a due diligence process. But I'm looking to work with great human beings first, who have a high bar for excellence second, and that's a very subjective thing because everybody thinks that they're great. And I'm actually writing an article right now that I haven't published yet, but there are things like KPIs, IRR, there's all these like acronyms for things. And I made one up. This time last year, my husband had a health issue, and he got COVID, and he's very immune compromised, so it was really big stuff. He stopped breathing one night because he was getting more sick, and he's totally fine now. But I had to perform CPR and get the ambulance and all that sort of stuff. And I just remember thinking in that moment, like, I have failed him. Like, I have been so addicted to work that I have not given him the life that he deserved. And I got a second chance, which is amazing. And over the last year, I've really been thinking about this, what I'm calling CPRs, which are centered peace reflections. And I feel like so many of us are walking around with so much consumer debt, tech debt, soul debt, that it is affecting our decisions. And, when I say consumer debt, obviously we know what that means, right? And, the thing that I heard a piece of advice once, which is all the stuff that you own is the stuff of future landfills and garage sales. Like, you don't need to, like, that's where it's going to end up. So, really think about where you're going to spend your money. Tech debt, to me, it's about distraction. Like, guard the door of your mind. And I have all my apps organized in morning, noon, and night, so I can restrict myself to what I'm allowed to go to at different times so that technology doesn't run my life. And I also I try to get rid of push notifications as much as I can, so that it keeps me focused. And then the soul debt is like, for me, this is a personal decision, but like, I was so addicted to work and relationships and my network and things like that, and it was getting bigger and bigger. And then I realized, I only have one husband, I only have one body, I only have one soul, I only have one family. Like, what are the things I only have one of? And like, what are the micro decisions I'm making on a day-to-day basis that are affecting those assets? And I used to think that people who appreciated work-life balance were lazy people. Like 10 years ago, that was me, but I'm not that way anymore. And it really, it affects like who I am and how I treat people on a day-to-day basis. And I think at this time, it's so important to be thinking about who you're working with and how you're leading, because There's a narrative economic principle called the fourth turning. Are you familiar with this?
No, please share.
Okay. So there, I don't have any visuals for you, but there's a drawing. It is very simple. It's hard times create strong people who create good times, who create weak people, who create hard times, and it just goes around and around and around. And
That's good. I like that. We'll look that up.
and the fourth turning is about it's a theory that history repeats itself every 80 years. Well, it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? Like it's very similar. So the fourth turning is every 80 years, history repeats itself. You can break it down into 20-year increments. So the first 20 years of the turning is well, right now we're in crisis. We're in the 20 years of crisis, which then goes to resurgence. The next 20 years, and the next 20 years is just pure success, and then the next 20 years is descent, which goes back into crisis. So how we carry ourselves in the next 7 or 8 years, because 2030-ish is around when crisis is supposed to then turn into resurgence. It's really important the decisions we make and how we carry ourselves into the future, because we're setting a tone for the next cycle. And so if I think that founders are uniquely placed to solve a lot of problems, I think that how they carry themselves is going to impact how society dictates success, how it expresses itself. And so I think we have a very interesting burden to contemplate. And so how people do things is just as important as how successful they are.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think Fred Keel, the author of the book Return on Character, butcher the quote. He did a 7-year study of high character CEOs versus low character CEOs and proved out the high character CEOs outperformed by 5x. But he said, he imagines a world, and he passed away last year. He imagines a world where a person's character is just as valuable as what a person's skills or what they can do. And I think we've lived in a world where character has been kind of pushed to the curb in the name of all sorts of reasons as a criteria, which is, when I say character, I just mean behavior, civility, common decency. And we get tricked into thinking that actually is the better way, when in fact, on almost every level, it isn't. I love your analogy. It's, or that story. I'm going to look it up. And I do feel
I'll send you some links too.
Send it to me.
Yeah.
A strong burden to try to put forward and do the best we can with what's in our hand. And I sometimes call people rock stars, and I mean ROC stars, Return on Character, and you are certainly one of them.
Oh,
I am so honored to have you on the show, and you're a real good example, but you're also a profoundly thoughtful thinker. And
thank you.
And that's unusual, and
that means
I
a
think
lot.
we should leave it at this. But I just want to say thanks. Thanks for coming on and just sharing a piece of your mind and heart today.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, what you're dedicating your life to, like I said, is I think going to have a really long tail. If I have anything to do with it.
All right.
So anyway,
Well,
great to see you. And
thank you, Lauren.
let's talk soon.